Imagine living in a city where crumbling abandoned buildings surround you. Structures that were deserted decades ago, now resembling haunted houses. Every time you step outside, passing by these decaying buildings would surely give you chills. These abandoned places could easily become hubs for criminal activities. Sounds like a scene from an underdeveloped country, doesn't it? But what if I told you this city isn't in a struggling nation? It's in the United States. Welcome to Detroit, Michigan. In 1950, Detroit was booming with a population of nearly 1.85 million people. By 2020, this number had dropped drastically to 639,000. By 2022, it had further shrunk to 620,000. Over the past 7 decades, the population of what was once America's 5th largest city has decreased by a staggering 66%, 2/3 of its peak population. Now, Detroit ranks 26th on the list of major U.S. cities. With such a sharp population decline, naturally, the buildings and apartments that once housed residents were left abandoned. As a result, many areas of Detroit today are filled with eerie, empty structures. Estimates suggest there are over 100,000 abandoned buildings and homes in Detroit. Vacant lots where buildings once stood are now covered with overgrown grass, with around 100,000 such lots across the city. In just the past decade, nearly 28,000 abandoned houses have been demolished. But the decay doesn't end there. This once thriving city now has an unemployment rate of 8.2%, twice the national average. The poverty rate is over 30%, nearly 3 times higher than the national average. Meanwhile, cities like Delhi in India have grown from 1.3 million people in 1950 to over 32 million today. Shanghai, China, has expanded from 4 million to over 30 million. And Mexico City has surged from 3 million to 22 million in the same period. So, what caused such a drastic population decline in Detroit? Why were homes and entire buildings left to rot? And what factors contributed to this dramatic change? To understand this, let's first take a closer look at the location of Detroit. Situated along the Detroit River, this city lies on the U.S.-Canadian border, connecting Lake St. Clair to Lake Erie. The Canadian city of Windsor is right across the river. Note that our discussion focuses on Detroit City itself, not the metropolitan area, which still has a population of about 4.3 million. The first reason behind Detroit's decline is economic. To fully understand this, we need to go back to the early 20th century. After World War I, the American economy was booming, and car manufacturing companies like Ford, General Motors, GM, and Chrysler, now Stellantis, established major production plants in Detroit. The rising demand for cars required a large labor force, drawing workers from across the country to Detroit, causing the city's population to grow rapidly. However, during the Great Depression, Americans cut back on spending, reducing the demand for manufacturing jobs, and Detroit's population growth slowed. After World War II, the U.S. economy rebounded, and Detroit's population peaked at 1.85 million in the 1950s. To accommodate the growing population, new homes and buildings were constructed. But trouble was brewing. By then, Japanese and European cars had entered the U.S. market, increasing competition for Detroit's big 3 automakers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler. American-made cars were more expensive, leading consumers to prefer cheaper, fuel-efficient Japanese cars. In response, the Big 3 began outsourcing manufacturing to other states and even overseas. Automation in manufacturing plants also reduced the need for human labor. As job opportunities diminished, many residents left the city in search of work elsewhere. The oil crisis of the 1970s further worsened the situation. As fuel prices soared, Americans abandoned the gas-guzzling cars made by Detroit's automakers in favor of more fuel-efficient Japanese vehicles. The decline of the auto industry had a ripple effect on suppliers and service providers, many of which shut down, causing even more job losses. As businesses closed, residents left, reducing the city's tax revenue. With less tax revenue, the city couldn't maintain public infrastructure, health services, education, or security, prompting even more people to leave. The downward spiral continued, and property values plummeted. Many homeowners couldn't sell their properties, so they simply abandoned them and never returned. The decline of the auto industry triggered an economic collapse, resulting in abandoned buildings, population decline, and an overall sense of decay that Detroit still struggles with today. The second major factor is racial tensions. In 1950, 84% of Detroit's population was white, while only 16% were African American. Historically, relations between these racial groups were strained. As African Americans began to move into the city in larger numbers, many white residents fled to suburban areas, unwilling to live alongside them. This phenomenon, known as white flight, accelerated population decline. By 1970, when Detroit's population was around 1.5 million, the African American population had grown from 16% to 44%, while the white population had dropped to 56%. The third factor is crime. Economic decline often leads to rising crime rates, and Detroit was no exception. At its peak, the city earned the unfortunate nickname, the crime capital. Many residents left because they no longer felt safe. Even today, Detroit's crime rate remains alarmingly high at 60 crimes per 1,000 residents, nearly 3 times the national average. The fourth factor is governance issues. Corruption and financial mismanagement by city officials eroded public trust. In 2013, a former mayor of Detroit was sentenced to 28 years in prison on charges of corruption, bribery, and fraud. Although he was later pardoned by President Donald Trump in 2021, the damage to the city's reputation had already been done. Detroit's financial mismanagement culminated in the city filing for bankruptcy in 2013, declaring $18 billion in debt, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. So, the decline of Detroit can be attributed to a combination of economic downturns, racial tensions, rising crime, and poor governance. These factors have been extensively documented in books, including Detroit, An American Autopsy by Charlie LaDuff. But there's a glimmer of hope. Recent statistics show a slight increase in Detroit's population. Some abandoned buildings are being renovated, and vacant lots are being used for urban farming. Community-led efforts aim to revitalize the city and make it appealing to new residents. Several abandoned structures, including the world's largest derelict auto plant, the Packard Automotive Plant, are in the final stages of demolition, with completion expected soon. This extensive process began as early as 2017 and intensified in 2022. After the demolition, the city plans to redevelop the site into an industrial or manufacturing facility, potentially linked to the automotive sector, as part of its broader efforts to revitalize the local economy. Meanwhile, residents are also receiving self-defense training to help combat crime and enhance community safety. So, what do you think of Detroit's journey from prosperity to decline? Did you find this video informative and thought-provoking? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more engaging and insightful content. If you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends so they can benefit from these intriguing insights too. Thanks for watching.